The room is quiet in a way that feels heavy, like the air itself is waiting for something to break. A small table, plain walls, a chair that never feels comfortable no matter how long someone sits in it. When Richard Allen walks into the interrogation room, nothing about the scene looks dramatic at first. No shouting, no slammed doors, no explosive confrontation. But the most revealing interrogations rarely start with chaos. They start with stillness, because stillness gives the body nowhere to hide. Allen sits down, and immediately his body seems to shrink inward. His shoulders don't square. They slope. His arms stay close, not resting openly on the table but pulled in, contained. The subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't consciously notice, but investigators are trained to notice everything. When someone instinctively makes themselves smaller, it often signals vulnerability, a feeling of exposure, the awareness that control may already be slipping. At first, his movements are minimal, controlled. He answers introductory questions without visible resistance. His voice doesn't shake. His posture stays mostly consistent. This is what preparation looks like. Not confidence, but readiness. As if he anticipated this moment and rehearsed how it should begin. Then the conversation shifts. Not abruptly, carefully. Names are mentioned. Places. Time frames that mirror what the public already knows. Nothing accusatory yet. Just facts calmly laid out. And that's when the body starts talking louder. His jaw tightens. Not dramatically, but enough to be seen. His lips press together between answers, as if he's holding something back. His hands, which had been relatively still, begin to move. Small adjustments. A thumb rubbing against a finger. A brief clasp, then separation. These are self-soothing behaviors, often unconscious. The body's attempt to regulate rising internal pressure. What makes this moment important isn't that he looks nervous. Anyone would be nervous in that room. What matters is timing. These behaviors don't appear at random. They emerge precisely when the conversation brushes against specific details. Details that demand accuracy. When Allen is asked broad questions, his responses come quickly, almost reflexively. But when the questions narrow, when they require specificity, something changes. There's a pause. Not long enough to feel like silence, but long enough to feel intentional. A fraction of a second where his eyes shift, his breath changes, and his mind appears to switch gears. That pause is critical. In behavioral analysis, quick answers usually come from memory. Pauses often come from construction, from deciding how to respond rather than recalling what happened. Again, this doesn't prove anything by itself. But patterns are built from moments like these. As the questioning continues, Allen's eye contact becomes inconsistent. During neutral conversation, he looks up. When topics turn uncomfortable, his gaze drifts downward or away. This isn't about deception in a cartoonish sense. It's about discomfort, about the body pulling back when the mind feels cornered. At one point, investigators stop talking. They let the silence sit. This is where many interrogations quietly turn. Silence removes structure, takes away the script. People who feel secure often use silence to think. People under internal strain often try to escape it. Allen shifts in his chair. He swallows. His foot moves. His hands reposition again. The room hasn't changed, but his body is reacting as if something is closing in. By the end of this early phase, there's a noticeable fatigue setting in. His posture slackens slightly. His movements slow. The effort of staying controlled is starting to show. And this is just the beginning. If you're finding this breakdown revealing so far, take a second to like the video. It helps more people see this analysis, and it tells me to keep digging deeper into cases like this. The next stage of the interrogation doesn't rely on pressure. It relies on precision. Investigators begin looping back, revisiting earlier statements, asking similar questions in slightly different ways. Not to confuse him, but to test consistency. And this is where the stress concentrates. Allen's answers start to shorten. Not sharper, just tighter. His tone flattens. Emotional range narrows. This often happens when someone is devoting more mental energy to maintaining alignment between past and present statements. It's exhausting. The brain isn't just responding anymore. It's monitoring itself. His body mirrors this mental load. His shoulders rise slightly, then drop. A controlled breath that looks practiced. His hands stay closer together now, less expressive than before. Movement becomes restrained, as if he's afraid that any extra motion might give something away. When investigators mention timelines again, there's another pause. Longer this time. His head tilts slightly forward. This posture often appears when someone is focusing inward, replaying sequences, checking for errors. His response when it comes is measured, careful, almost rehearsed. And rehearsed answers sound different. They lack natural rhythm. They come out smoother than spontaneous speech, but oddly less human, less textured. It's not what he says that stands out here. It's how much effort it seems to take to say it. Then comes contradiction. Not an accusation, just a gentle presentation of two statements that don't quite align. Investigators don't raise their voices. They don't push. They wait. Allen's reaction is immediate. His eyes drop. His mouth tightens again. He shifts his weight, this time more noticeably. His body is reacting before his words do. That split second matters. It's the space where instinct beats strategy. When he responds, his voice is quieter. Not softer emotionally, but lower in volume. This often happens when confidence dips. When someone isn't sure the ground beneath them is solid anymore. The silence returns. This time it lasts longer. And Allen doesn't fill it with words. He fills it with movement, a repositioning of his arms. A lean back, then forward again. His body is searching for relief, searching for a way out of the moment without saying the wrong thing. By now, the mental fatigue is unmistakable. His posture has lost its early rigidity. His shoulders sag slightly. The effort of control is wearing him down. This is what prolonged cognitive strain looks like. Not panic, not collapse, just erosion. It's important to understand that investigators aren't watching for one dramatic giveaway. They're watching for clusters, repeated reactions to the same categories of information. And in this interrogation, those reactions keep orbiting the same areas. Where, when, and whether he was there. Nothing explodes in this room. No sudden confession. No cinematic twist. What unfolds instead is quieter and more unsettling. A gradual narrowing. A sense that the body is working harder than the words. As the session draws closer to its end, Allen appears drained. His movements are slower now. Less guarded, but not more open. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. And that's the unsettling part. Because interrogations like this don't always reveal answers in the moment. Sometimes they reveal pressure points. Places investigators know to return to later. Places the body has already marked as sensitive. If this kind of deep, psychological breakdown is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed. These cases are complex, and we go where the surface narratives don't. In the end, what makes this interrogation haunting isn't what's said. It's what happens in the gaps, in the pauses, in the involuntary reactions that slip through the cracks of control. Because words can be shaped, but the body speaks in reflex. And in this room, under quiet pressure, those reflexes may have said more than any statement ever could. If you think someone else would find this analysis compelling, share it with them. Conversations like this matter. And the more eyes that look closely, the clearer the truth becomes. The interrogation didn't end with flashing lights or a sudden confession. There was no single sentence that sealed Richard Allen's fate in that room. Instead, what happened there worked quietly, almost invisibly, weaving itself into the larger case piece by piece. And that's exactly how it became powerful enough to matter in court. Because convictions are rarely built on one moment. They're built on alignment, on whether a person's words, behavior, and reactions can survive sustained scrutiny. And the interrogation was where that scrutiny began. From the prosecution's perspective, the interrogation wasn't about forcing the truth out of Allen. It was about testing him, seeing how he handled pressure, watching how he reacted when his own statements were placed beside each other. The goal wasn't to trap him into a mistake in real time. It was to observe how his version of events held up when stress was applied. And that's where the interrogation became foundational. Allen came into that room presenting himself as cooperative, calm, willing to answer questions. That image mattered later because it removed the defense's ability to claim he was immediately mistreated or coerced. On record, he was speaking voluntarily, answering without resistance. That alone gave weight to everything that followed. But as investigators guided the conversation deeper, the cracks didn't appear in the form of dramatic contradictions. They appeared as inconsistencies in confidence, as hesitation where clarity should have existed, as discomfort that repeatedly surfaced around the same topics. Those patterns were documented. Every pause, every shift, every delayed answer tied to specific questions was logged, time-stamped, and later revisited. When prosecutors reconstructed the timeline of Allen's statements, they didn't just rely on transcripts. They relied on video, on how his demeanor changed when he was asked about certain locations, on how his body language shifted when timelines were narrowed. This mattered in court, because juries don't just hear what someone says, they see how they say it. When the interrogation footage was introduced, it wasn't framed as a confession. It was framed as context, as a window into how Allen responded when confronted with facts that would later become central to the case. The prosecution didn't need him to admit guilt in that room. They needed the jury to see that his certainty wasn't consistent. One of the most impactful elements was how Allen handled repetition. Investigators asked similar questions at different points in the interrogation, spaced apart by time and topic changes. On the surface, his answers sounded aligned, but the way he delivered them wasn't. Early responses were quicker, more fluid. Later ones became measured, cautious, and slower. That shift suggested mental effort that jurors were later invited to consider. Why would recalling the same information require increasing effort? The prosecution didn't answer that question outright. They let the footage speak. They let jurors observe the pauses, the tightening of his posture, the change in tone, the subtle stress responses that grew more pronounced as the interrogation progressed. Another key factor was how Allen reacted to evidence being introduced indirectly. Investigators didn't lay everything out at once. They referenced known facts gradually. When those facts aligned with Allen's earlier statements, his body remained relatively neutral. But when they brushed against areas that later evidence would contradict, his demeanor changed. In court, prosecutors connected those moments. They showed how Allen's discomfort in the interrogation lined up with later discoveries. How the topics that triggered visible stress were the same topics that became critical at trial. This created a narrative of internal awareness. Not proof of guilt on its own, but awareness of vulnerability. And juries understand awareness. The interrogation also helped establish intent and mindset. Not through words, but through behavior. Allen wasn't panicked. He wasn't confused. He wasn't emotionally volatile. Instead, he appeared controlled, deliberate, and increasingly cautious. That presentation worked against any argument that he was overwhelmed or misunderstood the gravity of the situation. Control can be a double-edged sword. In the courtroom, the prosecution emphasized that Allen had opportunities to clarify, to correct, to elaborate. Instead, he often chose brevity, precision, minimalism, and while that's legally smart, it also opened the door for interpretation. For the idea that he was carefully managing what he revealed. The interrogation also locked Allen into early positions. Statements made in that room became reference points, anchors. Once spoken, they couldn't be erased. And as the investigation moved forward, those early statements were compared against physical evidence, witness accounts, and later admissions. When discrepancies emerged, the prosecution didn't need to accuse him of lying outright. They only needed to show that his story evolved, that his certainty shifted, that his comfort level changed as more facts came into play. And it all traced back to that first sustained questioning. Perhaps most importantly, the interrogation shaped how Allen was perceived as the narrator of his own story. Jurors weren't just evaluating evidence. They were evaluating him, his credibility, his reliability, his consistency under pressure. The footage showed a man who could maintain composure at first, but whose body gradually betrayed the mental toll of maintaining that composure. By the end of the session, the fatigue was visible, his posture less rigid, his movements slower, his responses more restrained. That exhaustion mattered, because it suggested that the version of events he presented required effort to sustain, that it wasn't something he could recount effortlessly. And in a case built on timelines and presence, effort implies complication. The defense argued that the interrogation proved nothing, that body language is subjective, that stress is natural, and they weren't wrong. But the prosecution didn't present the interrogation as proof. They presented it as support for a broader narrative. They showed how Allen's behavior aligned with the evidence, how his stress points matched the investigation's focal points, how his controlled demeanor cracked just enough to reveal pressure. And juries are drawn to alignment. The interrogation also played a psychological role beyond the courtroom. It set the tone for how Allen was viewed moving forward. Once investigators identified where his stress concentrated, they knew where to dig. The interrogation didn't close the case. It guided it. Every follow-up question, every warrant, every investigative decision carried echoes of what they saw in that room. The areas where Allen struggled became the areas investigators refused to let go. By the time the case reached conviction, the interrogation had already done its job. Quietly, thoroughly, it had shaped the narrative without shouting. It had laid groundwork without demanding attention. And that's why it mattered. Not because Richard Allen confessed in that room, but because he revealed where the truth was fragile. If you're following this case and want to understand how moments like this influence outcomes long before a verdict is read, take a second to like the video. It helps this analysis reach more people who want depth, not just headlines. The interrogation wasn't the climax. It was the blueprint. And when the jury looked back at it, they weren't just seeing a man answering questions. They were seeing the first place where his story began to bend under its own weight. That bend didn't break in the interrogation room, but it never straightened again. Because once the cameras are off and the chairs are empty, what remains isn't just footage. It's interpretation. It's understanding why the human body reacts the way it does when truth, fear, memory, and consequence collide. Criminal psychology exists because words alone are unreliable. People lie. People forget. People tell partial truths. But the body operates on a deeper level, one that doesn't always wait for permission from the mind. And that's why body language analysis has become such a powerful companion to justice. Not as a shortcut, not as proof, but as a guide. In high-stakes investigations, psychologists and behavioral analysts don't look for single gestures. They look for clusters, a gesture repeated under the same emotional conditions, a reaction that consistently appears when certain topics are raised, a pattern that emerges only when pressure is applied. Because behavior, when viewed over time, begins to form a psychological fingerprint. What makes body language valuable in criminal psychology isn't that it reveals guilt. It's that it reveals stress. And stress is where truth and deception often separate. When someone speaks honestly about an event they remember, their body usually aligns with their words. The posture remains stable. The rhythm of speech flows naturally. Movements support the story instead of interrupting it. But when someone is managing information, when they're filtering, editing, or withholding, the body often starts to work harder than the words. That extra work shows. It shows in delayed responses, in tightened muscles, in controlled breathing that becomes more noticeable the longer it's maintained. The mind can rehearse language, but rehearsing the body is far more difficult, especially over extended periods. Criminal psychology teaches that deception isn't just about lying. It's about cognitive load. The mental effort required to keep facts straight, avoid contradictions, and anticipate consequences. That load increases when questions become specific, when timelines are revisited, and when silence removes the chance to deflect. Body language reacts to that load instinctively. This is why interrogations are structured the way they are. Not to intimidate, but to observe. Not to trap, but to test consistency. Investigators and psychologists understand that stress itself isn't meaningful. Everyone feels stress. What matters is where it concentrates. When stress appears evenly across all topics, it suggests general anxiety. When it spikes repeatedly around the same themes, it suggests psychological significance. That's when analysts pay closer attention. And that attention can change the course of a case. In criminal psychology, body language analysis helps narrow focus. It helps investigators decide which statements need corroboration, which timelines require deeper verification, which details may hold more weight than initially assumed. It doesn't replace evidence. It points to where evidence should be sought. This is how it aids justice. Because justice isn't just about catching someone in a lie. It's about ensuring that the truth, whatever it is examined from every angle. Body language helps prevent tunnel vision by highlighting inconsistencies that words alone might conceal. It also protects the innocent. When someone consistently displays stress responses across all questioning, psychologists may interpret that as situational anxiety rather than deception. When someone remains relaxed even under direct confrontation, it may suggest confidence in their account. These interpretations can stop investigators from pursuing the wrong path too aggressively. That balance matters. Body language analysis, when done responsibly, slows things down. It forces investigators to ask why a reaction occurred instead of assuming what it means. It keeps the process analytical rather than emotional. And that's crucial in serious cases. In the courtroom, criminal psychology helps juries understand behavior without sensationalism. Instead of saying, "This proves guilt," experts explain what behaviors indicate stress, effort, or cognitive strain. They explain limitations. They emphasize that body language supports evidence rather than replacing it. This transparency strengthens justice rather than weakening it. Because when jurors understand that no single gesture convicts a person, they become better evaluators of the full picture. They learn to weigh physical evidence, testimony, and behavioral patterns together, not separately. That's why body language analysis holds such importance in modern justice systems. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's disciplined. It demands patience. It requires training. And it resists oversimplification. Criminal psychology also reminds us of something uncomfortable. That the human mind is complex. That people don't always behave the way we expect them to. That fear can look like guilt, and confidence can look like innocence. Which is why analysis must always be cautious. But cautious doesn't mean useless. When patterns align across interviews, interrogations, and evidence, body language becomes one more thread reinforcing the truth. It helps explain why certain moments mattered, why investigators focused where they did, why cases unfolded the way they did. In the context of justice, that understanding builds trust. Trust that decisions weren't rushed. Trust that conclusions weren't based on instinct alone. Trust that behavior was examined with the same seriousness as physical proof. And that trust matters not just for convictions, but for credibility. Because justice systems don't just punish wrongdoing. They send messages. Messages about fairness, about rigor, about how deeply the truth is pursued. Body language analysis, rooted in criminal psychology, reinforces those messages when used correctly. It adds depth to investigations. It brings human behavior into focus without turning it into spectacle. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that silence speaks, that reactions matter, that the body, under pressure, reveals where the mind is working hardest. Not because it wants to confess, but because it's human. If this kind of psychological breakdown helps you see cases differently, take a moment to like this video. It supports thoughtful analysis over surface-level conclusions, and it helps more people understand how justice is actually built. And if you want to keep exploring how criminal psychology, behavior, and evidence intersect in real cases, make sure you're subscribed. These stories don't end with headlines. They end with understanding. Because justice isn't just about what happened. It's about how we uncover the truth.